Okay, Park, I think you have stirred up a lot of emotions and thoughts and intellectual curiosity, as have the rest of you guys. I think what we should do now is open it up for dialogue with the audience. It would be great if you could state your name and your affiliation before you ask the panelists questions. And so with that, why don't we just begin? Question.
So my question is, I think this will be a fun question. Barton, the title of your book, it conjures up images of Cheech and Chong. Can you elaborate on the content?
You must be talking about Where There's Smoke, not For Cotton Country. The content of it is a cookbook. It is my second cookbook. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about this. Just published at the beginning of April, and it is about grilling. And I prefer grilling just as a method because the heat itself becomes an ingredient in the food in a way that allows for healthier cooking. You can sort of negate the flavor crutches of stock, cream, butter, and salt by the influence of smoke. Plus, what I really love the most about grilling is that it's inherently celebratory, seasonal, and communal. It's an inherent way to, inherently draws you out of your shell to do something new and different. And when we talk about food use, highest and best use of food, gathering your friends and family around a meal that you're really paying attention to and celebrating, to me really celebrates the ingredients and the myriad measures by which it comes to our tables. And so it just sort of puts us in a more inherently sustainable mindset. And that's why I love cooking on the grill, and hence the content of the book. Thanks.
Excellent.
Not grilling cannibals.
No.
Other questions? Yes.
My name is Tracy Gerstel, and I work for CropLife International. And I just wanted to first thank the speakers for your presentations, and I wondered if all of you could comment a little bit more about the reality of some of the trade-offs you highlighted in different ways. And one example that I had seen recently at another international forum with the FAO and the CGIAR system was looking at the fact that inevitably not all foods that are good for you are actually good for the environment. And some of the examples that came up there, for example, is that when you actually look at the carbon footprint, for example, of vegetables and fruits, vis-a-vis a number of starches and sugars, unfortunately the carbon footprint often for fruits and vegetables is higher. And so it seems that there's not always this trade-off. There was, I think, an implication in one or two of the presentations here that what is good for you as an individual is also good for the planet. But I don't know that that's always so. So perhaps if you could just talk a little bit more about some of the challenges of trade-offs and what does that mean as well for policy and indeed human behavior.
You can tell that on average I'm more optimistic than that. With fruits and vegetables in particular, I think that the environmental, I see people.
Yeah. Hey, you can share Barton's.
Am I on?
No.
I will start over. You can tell that on average I'm a little more optimistic than that. I think of fruit and vegetable production as often being a comparatively resource efficient way of getting food. Some of the times that you'll see particular food products where you might reach a different conclusion include for fruits and vegetables that don't have a lot of caloric content, if you use calories as your denominator. So if you look at how much resources it takes to produce 100 calories of celery, it looks very much like celery is a very environmentally unsound thing to produce, but nobody's eating celery for the calories. When you think about each food in its place, kale and dark leafy greens are a delivery vehicle for micronutrients more than their delivery vehicle for calories. And when you think of the major fruits and vegetables, things like potatoes, tomatoes, apples, bananas, the things that we consume most frequently, they don't do so badly on environmental impact per per unit of food produced, and especially when you compare it to meat or animal products.
I'll also take a step. I think there's also a trade-off getting back to the use aspect of it, and looking at some of the slides earlier, a lot of the production of greenhouse gas emissions is coming from transport in fresh fruits and vegetables from plain, and well, great, let's freeze them. You know, let's start a cultural revolution around, and this comes from chefs, and this is my responsibility, I think, but looking at frozen seafood, looking at frozen vegetables and fruits as a way to minimize greenhouse gas. But I think there's also, you know, an important distinction here that we're going to have an impact, and that's okay. Currently, we're having too much of an impact, and so food production will always have carbon associated with it. And so we have to look at the systems by which it comes and begin to, you know, this larger, as you say, trade-off, but really not use that as, you know, to demonize carbon in its entirety, but really to find that sweet spot and the balance there. And I think that addresses, you know, the need for micronutrients, the need for cultural adaptation of, you know, hey, we're not just going to do away with celery because, well, it's written into the canon of French cookery. Good luck. And so I think it becomes both a cultural, scientific, and a behavioral aspect.
I agree with everything that's been said. I'll just make the point that, you know, obviously transportation is a major concern when it comes to a lot of the foods that are eaten in the United States. Transportation costs and the energy costs and the carbon footprint of all that foods that go from California to the East Coast, so on and so forth. Local and regional food systems in the United States are on the rise. They're growing. The demand for these things is growing. I'm not of the opinion that local food is always better, and nor is the USDA or the federal government. But that said, there's a lot of good research underway at USDA and elsewise, and a lot of collaborative research with a lot of universities and centers across the country, across different regions of the country, looking at the most environmentally responsible way to meet the growing demand for local foods and for regional foods and all that. And I think it's interesting, and I'm encouraged by the extent to which the direct-to-consumer channels of food distribution and food delivery are on the rise in a huge way across the U.S.
Yes, sir.
My name's Tim Lang from City University in London. Thank you for all the talks, very good. I wanted to ask Richard a question. You put up a slide which referred to stagnant wages, and yet you gave us lots of data about the constant, about 2% rise of food prices. In Europe, we see this as a slow but really significant squeeze. The public policy is not really addressing this, except to keep pressure on keeping those food prices down. But the food industry is one of the lowest payers of all the sectors. You got a comment?
Lowest payers?
Yeah,
of wages?
Wages, yeah. And second question to you all, where do you see behavior change actually occurring in this context of price as a factor?
I need you to, when you mention a squeeze, do you mean a squeeze from the perspective of the workers in the food system or among American consumers?
Well, both. Both. They're totally different, but they're very often the same people.
Sure. Well, you know, especially at the farm level, you know, there's an increasing concern, of course, that the farm share of the U.S. dollar is decreasing, and the extent to which that's just market forces at work, and the extent to which it's market power being abused by, you know, the processors and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of policies in place to provide a safety net for producers in the U.S. food supply, and I think that I like to think that the recent Midwest drought was an example of those, demonstrating some extent of success in that, you know, farm incomes ended up not being hit nearly as hard as they were or as were originally forecasted when the drought hit and we realized the extent of the drought. With respect to American consumers, obviously, as probably everyone in the room knows, median wages across the economy have been fairly stagnant for quite a long time, and meanwhile, retail food prices have been kind of trudging along 2.5%, 3% per year over the last 20 years or so. But that said, for most of these years that we're talking about, the rate of inflation for food prices has actually been slower than the rate of inflation overall. It's only since around 2006, 2007 that that's turned around, and that's where we start to see this squeeze. And that's where I think policy, machinations is going to be implemented and needed if this curve of the share of income spent on food in the U.S. continues to be a U. If it turns out to be a U or a reverse J, and we see that turn around, then there will be some real concerns about the real price of commodities in the U.S. and the extent to which those prices are being transmitted efficiently and fairly throughout the food supply system.
Great, thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Erika Gonzalez. I am from University of California, San Diego, and I was really interested in the point that was brought up on elasticity. And from what I've learned, elasticity, especially pertinent to food tends to be the last thing that Americans tend to think about when they purchase, and most of their income is usually spent on either housing expenses or other transportation or whatever it is. So I wanted to know if you have any policy recommendations for making food more affordable for people who cannot afford it.
Yeah, the two leading ones are the two leading recommendations are to think about nutrition assistance programs, but not only to think about nutrition assistance programs. So the food stamp program, or the SNAP program, already includes an automatic inflation updater. So every year there's a price estimate of what the inflation was for a particular basket of foods in the past year, and the benefit is increased proportionately. So luckily, nobody in the legislature has to pass that particular increase. That's all set automatically. But the other thing I encourage people who are sort of food system advocates to think about is not just about nutrition assistance programs and not just about food pantries and food banks, but as you think about food security and avoiding hunger and welfare for low-income Americans, that you think also about low-wage labor markets. That there used to be an agenda in the United States for economic improvement and anti-poverty progress that was bipartisan. So if you think about the late 1990s, there would have been a bipartisan people with one side of the aisle giving somewhat more emphasis to anti-poverty programs, and the other side of the aisle giving somewhat more emphasis to moving people into the workforce. And yet, from both sides, a sense that low-income Americans ought to be making economic progress. And I hear that from few people in recent years who have any political influence.
The only thing I'll add to that, just kind of picking up on where Park started in the food assistance programs, is that a lot of you are probably familiar with the WIC program, Women's, Infant, and Children, and that's another very large food assistance program in the U.S. that provides purchasing power for women, infant, and children, particularly low income across the U.S., to buy healthy foods, infant formula, milk, bread, cereals, the like. It's increasingly becoming clear that there is a bit of a structural problem in terms of cost containment in this program. It's not an entitlement-based program. The funding for WIC comes entirely from an annual appropriation from Congress, and so the extent to which women, infant, and children in the United States, particularly of low income, are able to be served by this or participate depends very largely on the cost efficiencies of the program. And in the last couple of years, there's become a much more concerted focus at USDA, FNS, and elsewhere on improving things like the vendor peer grouping strategy or the maximum allowable prices for food instruments across the program to help to maintain or even increase the overall participation capabilities of programs like this.
Yeah, I might add it's extraordinary that we heard that like half the people that are even eligible for SNAP are not signed up for SNAP. So what does that indicate in terms of our economic situation and the need to find bipartisan answers and improving the situation? Yes.
Hi, my name is Jillian Fry, and I work for the Johns Hopkins Center for Livable Future. I work on the links between public health and sustainable aquaculture, and I have a question for Mr. Seaver. I was wondering if you could tell us how you and your colleagues feel about the movement in the U.S. toward permitting large-scale offshore aquaculture in the Gulf of Mexico, and also the link between that type of aquaculture and wild fisheries.
Great question, and I love the work that you and your center do. Aquaculture accounts for over 50% of global consumption of seafood at this point. It's about 46% of global production because of the disparity for the forage fisheries that are often milled to industrial purposes. In the U.S. is globally, we're the third largest consumer of aquaculture products, and yet we produce 1.5% of the global production. This is a massive failure, I think, of opportunity. And we really should be farming more fish. Aquaculture has gotten a very bad rap through the years, and I think rightly so. However, it's a very young industry, it is a very dynamic industry, and it is a very, very well-capitalized industry. The changes that are occurring within aquaculture, even within the lowest grades of aquaculture, and sort of the lowest environmental forms, and oftentimes we sort of put up farmed salmon as that poster fish. The advances in technology that are happening are coming so rapidly that I predict that within 3 to 5 years, many of the environmental detriments of salmon farming are going to be negated because it's in capitalist interest to do so. And this is a perfect example of, escaped fish and, high input of fish meal and high input of antibiotics and disease outbreaks and predation. Guess what? Those cost money to the farmer. So the farmer is very aggressively working on these things. Through selective breeding capacity, we're beginning to develop strains of salmon and other seafoods that are high-level predators but are able to actually create long-chain fatty acids out of plant-based products, who are able to actually reserve omegas in the flesh when input is decreased. And so you have this amazing kind of finding natural capacities to manipulate these fish towards a more inherently sustainable product. There are products like maricultured oysters, clams, and mussels. This is about as sustainable as a food source as the world will ever find. It is not sustainable, it is restorative. I mean, we think of sustainable as balancing our checkbook. Eating an oyster is like making a deposit in your savings account. I mean, flat out. First of all, we're putting too many nutrients into the water, leading to algal blooms. Algae is nothing but food for oysters, clams, and mussels. They are the keystone species in many, many marine ecosystems. And yet we've removed the plumbing and put more input into it. So when we plant an oyster, not only does it sometimes breed and help to replenish native populations, it actually performs the exact same necessary and vital ecosystem services. It then performs the same keystone functions, allowing sunlight to penetrate farther through the photic zone to create habitat and substrate for other species, thus actually increasing the total biodiversity and biomass of ecosystems. And wait, you can accomplish all of this with a 6-pack of beer and a dozen oysters? Yeah, that's pretty sweet. That's the kind of environmentalism that people can really get behind. And so I think that there is a big opportunity here that's missing. And in terms of the impact on wild fisheries, there is not going to be an impact on wild fisheries. I think all too often there's this charisma argument that somehow wild fisheries are going to get pushed to the side and aquaculture is going to become the favored stepchild. That's not true. Aquaculture is a way to create new products, not take the place of old. So we need to restore wild fisheries through their pride, profit, prudence, and permanence, which is actively happening. And we have the best managed fisheries in the world. They're not all perfect, but they're all getting better. And so we need to have a complementary aquaculture program that's only going to create jobs, make better use of our existing resources, and ultimately add to our food security. Something that most people don't understand about America is there's more America underwater than there is above it. Our exclusive economic zone is much larger than our terrestrial territory. And so we are not taking full advantage of it. We're not creating jobs. We're not creating the economic drivers. And I think it's time we do so. Thank you.
Yeah, I have to comment, Barton, you will be sought out afterwards to help the aquaculture industry fight the good battles against the Alaska senators and educating them about how the two can work together, how the systems can work together. Yes, sir.
Okay, Robbie Burns with Grocery Manufacturers Association. A question, all three of you talked about economic impact on sustainable food and food choices and making food available for everybody. But do you know, is there any information on the price of food and health? I'm kind of struck by, I think it was Ricky, your slide that you showed that as food prices decrease, I couldn't help but look at that's probably a good reflection on the increase in the rate of obesity in the United States. I'm reminded of a study recently from and I think it was in British Medical Journal, that talked about the food shortages in Cuba in the 1990s, which was also coupled with fuel shortages. So I don't know whether it was food or fuel, but the net outcome was that there was a decrease in obesity and a decrease in type 2 diabetes in Cubans that then rebounded after food prices stabilized. So any comment on food price and health?
I'll just get it started by saying there's a long literature going back to looking at data going all the way back to the medieval times, as you might know, that does show that there tends to be an inverse relationship in societies between the real price of food and health problems related to obesity and overweight and all that. And a lot of people are kind of bringing that up now when we talk about the structural change that's going on in food marketing as the supercenters are growing in number in the dollar stores and all these non-traditional formats, and what's happening to the price of food, and then what's the second stage effect on health. And I'll just say that from my perspective, looking at the data on the food retail sector, on the choices that consumers are making, I don't think that food prices now in the United States, and this wealthy, very industrialized nation with this very, very well-developed food supply system, I don't think that the price of food is a major driver of the obesity level or diabetes or all these other food-related issues. I do think, though, that there are important considerations with respect to store format, whether consumers are purchasing their food at home or away from home, and then even within the at-home market, we're starting to see that there are important differences where you shop matters, whether you shop at supercenters or club stores or dollar stores or even convenience stores. To buy your food at home, to buy your meals, to cook at home is having implications on health. And the reason why I bring up that distinction is because at these non-traditional stores that I'm mentioning, food tends to be cheaper. Whether you measure it on a per serving basis or a caloric basis, these non-traditionals tend to have cheaper food. And it's a concern of mine that people may be conflating this issue as being simply the relationship between food prices and health, when really I think it's more of an issue of the relative prices within these formats, food availability, the product menus across these stores, and other factors like that, what kind of ingredients are going into the private labels and that sort of thing. So in my opinion, in the modern retail food retailing environment in the U.S., that's a bigger issue, is these formats and how they're evolving to meet consumer demand and shape consumer demand.
And I'll pass it on to Park. In my travels in Cuba, I don't mean in any way to be flippant about this, in travels in Cuba, the period of food scarcity is called the special period, and it's called special period because that no one wants to talk about it. I mean, it was a nasty, nasty chapter in their history, and it's not a celebration of a reduction of disease. I understand there's much information to be mined from that experience, certainly. But also with regards to obesity, I think all too often we think of obesity merely as a symptom of food. It's not. It's a social construct. I mean, health itself is a social construct. Obesity is the product of a system that's not set up to sustain humans. We have architecture that designs houses built around televisions. We have cities eviscerated by freeways. We don't have access to parks, and it's not part of our educational process. Certainly food is a vehicle, absolutely, no denying that, but it's also part of a much broader societal construct of really what we expect the quality of life to be.
So just two comments. One is I think it's important to think about a wide variety of plausible explanations for obesity, and it makes sense that no one of them is likely to have all of the answer. And on the list is the secular decline in the cost per person relative to their income of food, but that's a trend that we wouldn't have wanted to reverse. That's a sign of prosperity. And it makes me think about how we sometimes think inconsistently about prosperity. Remember, prosperity is a good thing if we can get it. And sometimes people worry about rising incomes for people in India and China. And the logic is, these rising incomes are going to lead people to purchase more meat. And the purchase of more meat is going to lead to food scarcity. And the food scarcity is going to cause them all to starve. And there's something wrong in this cycle, because it's not possible that increased prosperity leads to starvation, right? So you know that at some point in this cycle, there must have been an error in thinking. And the error in thinking has to do with how prices respond to the scarcity. So if incomes go up, people want to consume more meat. The price of meat goes up, which partly offsets the increased meat consumption that they were able to get because of their higher incomes, and things come to a new equilibrium where people are better off, but they're not able to eat endless amounts of meat. And that's really all for the best. And so I think we have to think of the prosperity that makes our foods low priced relative to our income as a good thing, notwithstanding the challenge it gives us to eat well.
Great. We have time for one more question, and then I'm just going to make a brief comment to the panelists that I want them to respond to in conclusion.
Great, thanks. Jack Spengler, interesting session. And I want to follow up on an intriguing figure that I think Richard Volpe, from the Max Planck Institute, showing shifts of agricultural patterns in the United States and I think up into Canada in 2030 or so. I forget what the projections were. Well, trends have been underway for some time, 40 years according to NOAA, shifting precipitation, temperatures, growing season patterns. My question to you is, do you see any evidence now that agribusiness is actually responding to these climate change patterns in the U.S.?
From where I sit, no. Although I'll be perfectly frank and say that even within ERS, there are people who would be better suited to answer that question than me. But when I look at going back to the last 10, 15 years of scanner price data, looking at to the best, so product sourcing is not something that I personally in the retail side have the clearest picture on, but I can see product menus, I can see prices, I can calculate relative prices and all that, I can see the emergence of private labels, the growth of organics and all that. From my perspective, in the last 10, 15 years or so, I haven't seen a clear response. However, I think the response is going to happen first in the production stage, the farm stage, and then it'll filter through to wholesale and so on and so forth, and there are going to be changes obviously in the global market in terms of trading and import and export and all that. So people who are genuinely interested in that and how the food supply system today might be taking actions to respond to this, there are plenty of economists who work in market and trade economics, both at ERS and beyond, who have their thumb on this and who might have a better idea on that particular issue at this point than I would, or people who I work closely work at the retail level.
Okay, great. Well, before we completely break up, you have one. We're
I
out
have
of time.
one more.
Yeah. Okay.
Just really to respond to that last point, because Derek Yach from Vitality, but previously with PepsiCo, and certainly over the last 5 years, I sat in two types of fora which addressed that question. The first was seeing the investment in long-term futures work by PepsiCo and many other companies with agricultural economists and climatologists, looking at what are the likely consequences 15, 20, 30 years from now, and taking very seriously the fact that some crops will be in the middle of a desert and other crops will be in the middle of a flood zone, and planning their commodity changes rather differently. The second is with the World Economic Forum, where there's a grouping of the major agricultural and food companies who have been continuously looking at this and publishing it and making, again, plans that extend 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years into the future, exactly because of the concerns and fears about what some of the climate changes will be. And this is not just on where you plant, but how you plant, the shift towards better agricultural practices, better seed, and so on. So I would say I've been struck that in the private sector there may even be a greater sense of urgency and awareness than I often pick up from governments.
Great. Thank you very much. So with that, I will do the moderator's amendment to my own rule. I want to thank you all. I think this global healthy systems approach is going to be hotly debated for years to come, and I thank you all for shedding your brilliance on the subjects today. Big hand for these guys, please. Thank you. Okay, I guess we are taking a break, and then Derek Yach will be back with Lisa Ekman.
We're going to resume around 4 o'clock. Thank you.